That should work. Excellent. Okay. That looks like that's... see what comes through. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Just need to close that down now. So I get strange feedback. Great. Okay, so we're almost ready. Brilliant. How are you anyway? How's your day been going so far?
I've just finished a project.
Okay.
So it's documentation, which is, there's so much to say, it's hard sometimes to pull it out of my head.
It's always a challenge. Okay, let me stop sharing the screen now and then we can go into full view. So I think we're all set up and running, which is fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining today's live edition of the AI Future Show. This is actually the third monthly live show that we've done, and fantastic to sort of continue the series. For anyone, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So anyone on the live streaming channels, please feel free to put your comments into your preferred channel, and we're streaming across YouTube, Periscope, Facebook and Twitcher as well. So anyone that's on any of these platforms can all put comments in throughout the show, and I will do my very best to sort of bring those questions into the conversation as we sort of go through. So that's fantastic. And yeah, so we're ready to start. So let me first of all do a little bit of a background and introduction. So I met Jen almost a year ago now. It was at a influencers dinner that was being held by Microsoft on the day before, or the evening before their conference, their Decoded conference, and it was hosted by one of the Microsoft leaders. It was actually Michael Wignall, who was the head of the Azure platform and machine learning in the UK. So he very kindly hosted a number of influencers. I think we had about 12 or 15 as a sort of round table. Very nice setup, sort of back room of a very nice restaurant, and lots of interesting conversations on the day. And I think we were both there, but sort of sat at opposite ends of the table. So we weren't quite able to sort of chat one-to-one, but certainly enjoyed the sort of the table conversations that were happening. So I'm very pleased to sort of have you on the show, Jen. So thank you very much for being part of this. I'll hand over to yourself to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your company, and then we'll start to dive into the topic. And for those that don't know, that have just joined, the topic today is all about AI leadership and delivery, and very much a focus on some of the opportunities and challenges with data for sort of small and medium-sized enterprises. So very much welcome to the show, Jen. Over to you to give the audience a little bit of an introduction.
Hello there, and thank you, Andy, for having me today. It's been really, really great chatting with you and sort of behind the scenes. And it's just been nice to get to know leaders like yourself in the community that are sharing their insights. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for having me along.
You're welcome.
So I've been in AI for 23 years, believe it or not. I was always passionate about computers. I learned to program when I was 8 years old. For those of you who remember Sinclair, I learned on a ZX81. So for those of you who don't know what that is, ask someone who's over 40. They will have heard of Sinclair. So I decided to go to university and learn about AI. And that's really been my passion ever since. I've delivered AI solutions for small and large organizations. I believe that AI is for everyone. There should be no barriers. It's not just about making AI for large enterprises, it's about making it useful for everyone. So in terms of my company, I founded my own company 10 years ago, Data Relish. There's a few of us, we're female-led. We believe in not just a data-driven culture, which is something that we hear a lot of, but we believe in an understanding-driven culture, where you can use data and AI and all sorts of data techniques in order to really bring value to businesses. And that's what we believe in. We love going in and making a difference. And AI is just one tool of many, I think, that people can use to do that.
Fantastic, and that's really good to sort of get a handle on your background and experience. So tell us a little bit in terms of what you see as some of the core challenges with data quality, data bias, and just generally with organizations with their data, because we hear a lot about data transformation, migrating to big data, migrating to the cloud. And I'm pretty certain that there's a whole heap of interesting stroke difficult challenges with those types of pieces of work. How do you give us some interesting insight into some of those challenges?
Well, often when I go into an organization, unfortunately, I do tend to find a lot of bad news in people's data. And there's a huge difference between the expectations around data and where companies actually are. And they don't know that always because they don't look. I don't know if you saw in the news yesterday, Andy, it made me smile and it made me want to cry. One of the hospitals in Scotland was actually delayed opening by about 6 months. And that was because of a data quality error in a spreadsheet that was not picked up by anyone. It was not picked up by the consultants. It was not picked up during the tender process. And there's going to be more of an inquiry. And we smile because it's so easily done. It's so easily done to make these errors. People tend to see spreadsheets as individual cells in a matrix. But actually what you're doing is building a model. And I don't think people really understand that there's a lot in that model, a lot of dependencies. Those are not well understood. So it's easy to blame the technology and say, well, it's Microsoft Excel's fault, it's Google Sheets, for example. But I think actually when you start to look hard at companies' data, it tells you a lot about the organization themselves. So are they doing diligent checking of anything? And it can also tell you something about the culture. Do people feel able to stand up and question something? Because sometimes there is a culture of silence where people don't want to say, well, actually, I don't feel that's right, or I'm not comfortable with that, or I'd like to double check something. And I believe there should be more people that are allowed to have a data whistleblower role in the organization, and I don't often see that. So I do see lots of challenges, and I vocalize those because I'm doing my job. And that doesn't make me popular. Being popular and being right are two different things. But I try and offer solutions as well to say, look, we have caught problems before they have got bigger. Let's turn that into a positive and let's see what we can do. And I often find that the company's objectives, when they're looking at the data, can sometimes morph into something quite different because they realize actually we are on a longer journey than we thought we were. And I think it's important for organisations to realise they're not alone in that. So people like you and I can help them to sort of reassess where they are and give them a better journey and what it looks like. I don't know if you see this, but I see lots of inherited failed projects, which then impact the relationships in the organisation. So you see the IT and the business are no longer talking to each other very well because of a failed IT project, a failed CRM project usually is where I tend to see it. And you end up with this really horrible disconnect. And I have been in meetings where the head of BI has walked out when the head of IT has arrived. And I don't know if you've seen that as well, but the politics is so difficult to come round. And I guess as an external consultant, I tend to absorb that because that's part of the role, right? You know, you succeed and then everyone points the finger at you for, for all the problems that have happened. But that's
Sure.
part of why you're there in some ways, is to suck up that poison. And it's got to go somewhere, it's got to be regurgitated. I don't know what you think about this, but I really think that technology leadership for 2020 and beyond is really about leadership in people and not as much about the technology that supports that. I think businesses are starting to understand that now.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think from my experience with running a number of different sort of technology projects, actually the technology is sometimes the easy bit. It's actually work. It's sort of the people and the process and dealing with all of those sort of challenges from office politics, from two people that need to work together don't want to work together, to sort of managing that whole process, I think is one element. I sort of want to reflect back on something you said a bit earlier, which I think is really important as well, that what a lot of people don't think of, and I think this can be quite important, it'd be great to get your view on it, is data can be versioned as much as code is versioned. And I think people, because data sort of sits in a spreadsheet or a database, you don't think about the versioning of the data, but it's certainly in transformational programs and projects and where there's lots of change, actually trying to figure out the best way to version those changes and make sure you've got the latest version that aligns, because bits of data can affect the functionality of systems as well. And if they're misaligned, it can cause lots of problems. So I don't know whether you've seen that as an issue in projects that you've worked in the past.
Yeah, I do think that data versioning is really important. And I do see some technologies like R, for example, that will help you to do that. I think that's important. I think what I do find is, taking a bit of a step back, organizations don't seem to have developed data dictionaries, and the versioning is part of that because you should have them both hand in hand with each other. I also don't see many people doing the basics. So descriptive statistics, for example, just get a handle on what the data looks like. Because if you can't do these basics, you won't have good AI. And I know that's probably a boring message. People tend to want to hear the ta-da, that we're going to, if it was going to talk to us, the program's going to search the internet for us, it's going to bring back these results, it's going to do all these amazing things. And you can do these things, but there has to be building blocks in the process as well. And these are important. And you're often inheriting systems and solutions which you did not build as a leader. And it's almost like people have a sort of Schrodinger's cat type of testing strategy. And in that, what I mean is, if they don't look at the cat, it might be all right. And I think there's a Schrodinger's cat attitude in testing, whereas if you don't look at the system, it might be all right. So I think
Yes.
that's important for people to actually to open the box and see, is it all right or is it not all right? You'll be familiar with the Schrodinger's cat paradox. If you don't look at it, if you do look at it, is it dead or alive? And I think when I look at people in their adoption of new systems, they don't always know what they've already got. I was working with one organisation that had 8 CRM systems, and people were typing in data into each of the CRM systems. And I was in a meeting with the CIO, and someone said, they popped their head around the door and they said, oh, we just need to sign off for another CRM system because it's got some functionality we need. The CIO was quite new. He'd been there for 4 weeks. And he said, excuse me a moment, Jennifer, please close your ears. And his language was very choice, and I will not repeat it here. But he essentially said, we are not having 9 CRM systems, because they did not look to see what they had already. And it's easier to buy new than it is to think, well, what have we got that we can work with? And I do try and ask organisations that. So if we've got I do find a lot of graduates are learning things like R and Python. They're coming out of university with these skills. So when I ask, or when I'm working with organisations, I do try and produce a skills matrix which sounds a bit consultancy, but it helps me to understand what have they got. And suddenly people will step forward and say, I really fancy picking up those skills again that I did at university. And I'm seeing AI stroke data science as a second career for many people, where they've become experts in one area and then think, I'm going to dive deeper and know the data. And that's great. I love to see that.
Yeah, it's hidden talent in the organization, isn't it? And I found, and when you start to sort of ask around, you'll find people, certainly people of my age at least, that have maybe done a PhD or an MSc in machine learning a few years ago and haven't had chance to use those skills and use that knowledge. And now, of course, the opportunity is there. And so actually asking around and finding those people, and it's not just AI machine learning, it's across the board with people that have sort of learned something that are not using it right now, but essentially it is that hidden talent that, again, as leaders in the organization, you have to try and squeeze that knowledge out and actually use your resources in the best possible way and make sure that you've got good alignment of that. It's really really important, I think. And lots of interesting challenges there. Have you worked so I see a lot of challenges in the sort of the kind of bridge between doing small, certainly on the analytics and the sort of predictive analytics, doing small innovative proof of concept work and then trying to sort of scale those up and move those into production. Do you see some problems and challenges there that are sort of common? And is there any data related challenges in those types of things as well?
Yeah, I'm just smiling to myself. I see that a lot. And I often see the proof of concepts becoming the robust production environment. And I think it was never designed to do that. I did go and see one customer who asked for a sticking plaster proof of concept a couple of years ago. And then I went back to see them recently, and they actually were still using it. And it was the production system. And I thought, really? That was your proof of concepts that you weren't going to take any further because you'd other initiatives, and suddenly it's still working. So I do see that. I think I like proof of concepts because I feel they start to ground people in the realities of doing these projects while still giving them something actionable that actually drives some value for the business. I think people learn a lot along the way. And I think these are the braver leaders, the ones that will do the fail fast type of projects. But I also like the best leaders I see at this are the ones who are willing to do safe to fail projects, where the team are allowed to say things like, well, we tried this and it didn't work. Because you always learn at least 10 things along the way that did work, or 10 things that you could look at afterwards. And I think giving people that safe environment is actually very important as a leader. Not making people feel bad or called out because it didn't quite work as they expected, because everyone is learning at this. And these people that are trying, you'll lose them and they'll go off somewhere else if they find other opportunities for themselves in that area. You wouldn't necessarily stop them or diminish them. They just might not do it for you. So I think there is an investment in trying to retain people who are learning these skills because they're extremely valuable, actually.
I completely agree that, and certainly when you look at data science in general, it's compared to normal sort of technology, if that's the right phrase. It probably isn't, but there is inherently a lot of experimentation and trial and error. And I think that whole, and I guess that's why it's called a science, in a sense, that there is that experimentation. And I think that naturally has to include the opportunity and the possibility of things not quite going as hoped. I won't say failure, because to your point, it's not a failure because you're learning and you're finding another way not to do something, and you just have to keep trying until you find the right way to do something. But I think and I fully agree with that, and I think it's fundamental to to the practice. However, I'm going to caveat that because what worries me now with the pandemic, with the focus on, the looming recession that, everyone's sort of saying is going to be the biggest since the 1920s or whatever. I worry that companies, big and small, will be less willing to experiment and less willing to risk doing projects where there could be some uncertainty and there could be elements of failure. So for me, as much as I support the cause and appreciate that there is that need for that sort of on the job learning, as it were, and that's actually the wrong phrase. It's about trying to find the best approach, if you like, or the best solution. But I worry that organizations are going to feel under a lot of budgetary pressure in the coming sort of 6-9 months, whereby trial and error isn't, or room to fail is not going to be an in vogue phrase for these leaders. I don't know what you think of that, and how we might as an industry sort of deal with that issue and problem.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people talk about no regrets projects, and I think that's a lovely phrase actually. I think it's where they have a choice of things to do during the pandemic. Often they've got IT staff at home, people are at home, and people's jobs have changed so radically in terms of what they're doing day to day. So I have seen an uptick in people asking for training and mentoring through no regret projects, or even just wanting to chat about what they will be measured by in 6 months or a year's time, and what they can do to say, well, actually, out of all the things we could have done, this is what we decided to do, and this is why. I think with data and AI, I see them as being popular choices for no regret projects, because every organisation has got data they need to clean up and things they'd like to do. But often keeping the lights on has been such a priority for IT that they've not been able to do any of these projects because they're trying to help the business do well and serve customers and that kind of thing. So I think that IT departments have done a wonderful job actually in turning around a very quick digital transformation. Suddenly many people are working from home. That has provided challenges. So a big shout out to the IT teams out there that have had to turn around security and think about new ways of storing data, perhaps doing a move to the cloud very quickly. I'm seeing that. But I think the leaders will be measured by what projects they decided to do. And I think there is that element of minimizing risk. I did speak to someone recently who said, well, any data project would almost be a safe bet for them because they had so many issues, and I totally get that. But moving into AI, I think people are starting to think about how can I automate processes to make things run faster? And I think there's an underlying question there, which is really about how can we bottle the progress that we have made in such a short period of time and keep that going? So ID departments have gone to the cloud really quickly or facilitated remote working really quickly. If they could do that in 7 days, in some cases, really quickly, then it becomes quite a hard question for IT leaders to answer, which is, well, we've been talking about going to the cloud for years. You asked for a huge budget, and all of a sudden you've turned it around in a week like that. So there's a mistrust there, and it's quite difficult to come back from that. And now the expectations have been set that, yes, you can set up and run a virtual conference in less than a week and get 30,000 people to attend, or you can go to the cloud really quickly. So I think that's going to be a harder question to answer. If you could do it in a week, then why did you ask for 6 months?
It's difficult, isn't it? And I think necessity is the mother of invention, right? So I think in times of crisis, many things are possible because you just knuckle down and get it done, right? People would be working 24 hours a day to sort of make sure that those things get done. But I guess unfortunately, it needs some crisis in order to really accelerate things. And I think it was the the CEO of Microsoft was quoted a few months ago at the start of the pandemic that COVID-19 is responsible for more digital transformation than any CIO over the last couple of years. And it is right, and it's exactly your point, right? But it's, yeah, I can understand that then, that, and it creates more friction between IT and business teams, because it's like, well, we've been asking you for this for ages. Why haven't you just done it? And yeah, it's a difficult one. The no regrets project is an interesting one, because I hadn't, before I'd started talking to you about this, I hadn't really heard that phrase before. And it's a really interesting one, because I mean, I'm assuming that is all about saying, well, it doesn't matter whether the project's successful or not. It moves us forward. It takes us to a place of learning that then allows us to explore other things. So it's a really interesting term. I've not really heard that phrase before, certainly not in the industries I've worked in, but yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm definitely going to remember that off the back of this, and make sure we sort of leverage that in future conversations. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, because I think there's always that decision point where people start to think about, should we use AI? And what they may not realize is they're probably using it anyway. I wrote a blog post this week which was about automation and AI, and it probably sounds quite highfalutin, automation. But actually, we use automation all the time. So when I send invoices and then it gets paid, it automatically sends a thank you note back, for example. I use a receipting system which takes my receipt, cracks it down and pops it into a format so it goes straight into my accounting system. And HMRC can go and look in that system anytime they want. It's HMRC compliant. Saves me a ton of time and a ton of admin and paperwork, which quite frankly, as anyone who works with me will tell you, I am really not good at. And something I don't enjoy repetitive work. I just don't. I'm not good at it. I'm thinking about other things, and I would do anything except that. So I think these solutions are ways forward that we can start to think about smoothing that process, and then it becomes less of a regret to do it. Because I spoke to one accountant recently who was spending 4 days out of 5 manipulating data in Excel, and the poor lady had her head in her hands, because we said, I didn't go to university and incur a huge student debt to be sitting and doing this for 4 days a week. This is not what I had planned.
And for me, yeah, and for me, this is the big vision of sort of, you know, AI and automation combined together, because, you know, for many of us in every role that we're, you know, that's sort of in the workplace, having the capability to automate the mundane so that we can focus on the more interesting work is brilliant, right? And I think, you know, the more of that we can get into our workplace, the happier and the more productive we're all going to be. And I think we'll all benefit from that, because, you know, you sat there typing in sort of invoices and receipts and things is not productive work for you, right? So why can't you give that to some piece of automation to just do straight away? And I think we all have those examples where, fed up of doing this sort of typing, you know, dual keying, or, you know, dual keying a customer into 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 CRM systems, right? It's just insane, right? Why would you, you know, want to do that? But it's just that kind of acceptance of the technology that actually it can help and can improve things. And I think I'm, you know, trying to find some good out of the pandemic. I actually think, you know, for some businesses where they saw massive spikes in business, you know, food retailers, for example, they can sort of now value automation, all these things that we got by with doing manually. When the volume spikes by 300% or whatever, it's just not achievable. It's not doable, let alone, having to just employ more people to spend 8 hours a day typing things in, right? It's just not practical. So I'm hoping that, again, a little bit of a, silver lining out of the pandemic is that, some companies and some leaders will sort of see, actually, if we'd have automated these things, we'd have been in a better position to sort of actually react and deal with things a bit better. So I'm hoping people will reflect on that for sure. I think it's really
especially if
interesting.
we do end up with a second wave or a third wave, or we never leave the first wave.
Yeah.
That actually, if anything happens, people are better set up for it next time. And I know that's something I'm certainly thinking about, is if what happens next, and what is the worst case scenario looks like for businesses and for myself as a small business. So I think I'm looking to automate as much as possible at the minute, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I hope, one of the things that I've been trying to do over the last sort of 4 or 5 years with my Informed AI group is to help people learn about the technology so they can apply it both into their personal lives, but also into their working lives as well, and trying to see how these technologies are useful, and not to fear the algorithm, which, with the recent craziness over the sort of A-level grades, and I think Boris Johnson called the mutant algorithm yesterday, and it's like, well, let's not blame the technology here. It's a combination of the technology, the people, the process, all of those things. But I think actually, I'm hoping that people will start to see the benefits in the technology and see how it can actually help situations like the pandemic, and future things as well. So that's really interesting. What's your take on so one of the things I hear and I've heard a number of times over the years has been about, oh, we can't do our analytics, we can't do machine learning because we haven't finished our data strategy, we haven't done our data quality sort of improvements. You must hear that a lot, right? I'm sure you hear that a lot. And how do you deal with that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I hear two main things actually. One is, why do we need a data strategy? We don't have one. We've managed to get this far without one. And that sounds like consulting rubbish. So I do hear that.
Okay.
And the second thing I hear is the opposite end, which is, well, we've been writing this thing for 2 years, and we still haven't finished yet, and we need to do this, this, and this. And I see two ends of the spectrum. So with the first person of the data who says data strategy, I don't need one, I tend to say that, well, you have been going for a certain length of time without one. I get that. But is it working for you? I don't think it is. And that's kind of why I'm here. You just need a journey for your data that matches and lines up to what your corporate mission statement looks like and what your goals and values in the business actually are. So I tend to try and say, well, you do have issues, and I can help you to solve those. But I don't want to just give you that sticking plaster. I want to give you something that has more longevity. So people tend to respond quite well to that. So the people that never stop writing the data strategy, I must say that annoys me more, because I think that you can develop these things in an agile type of way as you find out more as you go along, as the technology moves and as your business moves. I think you can have quite a high level business strategy for your data, and I think that's fine. Having nothing tells me that they haven't really understood the importance of their data to the business. And if they lose their data, they don't know who their customers are, their products, their pricing. I worked with one organisation a very long time ago who lost their entire support database of support calls. They lost everything and they had no backup. And I just didn't know what to say to them. How can we get it back? As well, like everyone else has told you that you've asked, actually is gone. Why don't you back it up? You don't know what your customers are complaining about. You don't know what they've been told. And then it's a big communication piece to then go back to individual customers and say, look, we've lost all of our email, all of our database. We don't know what you've told us.
Yeah.
And that just sounds a death knell for your customer support. So I have seen things like that. So these sort of thing a company can learn from. But I get concerned in situations like that one person gets blamed. And I worry in the spreadsheet fiasco that we saw in the Scottish hospital this week that was reported in the BBC. I'm worried that one person will get it in the neck for that. But actually, these things tend to be systemic. And that's why having a data strategy is important. And so I do see people delivering the never-ending data strategy. I do think that at some point you have to start doing it. Otherwise, I think the business get dissatisfied, and then that's when decisions have to be made, I think, over, are you going to start from scratch and just have a cut-off point, and why is the delivery not happening? And I think that's when the IT departments and the business departments become very divorced from one another, because people feel like there's a lot of talk, a lot of ideating, and not much doing. And sometimes in some organizations that's okay. I do see that sometimes, where you just think, what do people do? What are they doing? So I wish that, I think people are just getting into sort of analysis paralysis, and they lose more if they actually start to do something.
I think, for me, if you look back over the last sort of 10 years or so, organizations have been told they need to save their data. So they've sort of built these data warehouses, and it's sort of built up over time, very sort of siloed. Each department will be sort of storing their own bit of the overall enterprise data, and very sort of siloed and fragmented. Then you've had the sort of big data push to say, right, we need to bring it all together because there's more value having it all together. So we've sort of gone through that, and then some may have sort of then adopted the cloud to make it easier to work from home and to access the data remotely, et cetera, et cetera. So you've gone through that whole sort of data strategy essentially. But what's sort of slightly frustrating and annoying, and it'd be great to sort of get your reflection on this, is they've been storing the data but not been using the data and squeezing the insights out of the data. And there was a report done, I think it was by IBM a couple of years ago, saying maybe only 4 or 5% of all data that's stored is actually looked at and analyzed. And that's, for me, that's criminal, right? It's like we're keeping all of this historic data. We should be trying to gain some value and use out of it. Do you see that happening a lot at the moment?
Yes, I suppose I see is that sort of translated into a concern over how long people should be keeping their data for. And I think that's sort of rooted in GDPR, where companies are realizing actually we've got data that perhaps we should not have. And the incentive to try and sort it is actually coming from a potential legal threat, rather than an incentive from IT to do something to clean up the data. So I do see organizations starting to think more about how can we automate compliance. I've got an Amazon file store, which I was looking at this morning. And even on Amazon, you can set up compliance rules that will delete data after a certain length of time. And it's another piece of automation that I think is really useful, because if it is a piece of personal data that's over 7 years old, why you've still got that, because data protection often is interpreted as you need to retain that data for 7 years. But what's about 7 years and a month? So companies keep data for all sorts of things, for all sorts of length of time. I'll tell you a story that made me smile, actually. It was my dad, actually. He used to work in the textiles industry, and the Titanic movie makers contacted his carpet firm to ask if they still had an idea of what the carpets looked like in the Titanic. So my poor dad went down to the records, and they actually found the original patterns for the carpets in the Titanic from 1920 or something, and they still had them. They're 100 years old. So it was just they did not know they were there, they never looked for them. And actually, as a piece of history, that's a really interesting thing. So the upshot was they remade those carpets in the exact same style for the movie. So if you watch the movie, look at the carpets, that's
Brilliant.
what they look like.
Fantastic.
And I think organisations just don't know what they've got sometimes. And there's that valuable aspect to it.
Yeah, and they could have been selling that to people for years, right? Sort of, have a bit of the Titanic carpet in your hallway or something, right? But yeah, it's very interesting. One thing that interests me, I've always been fascinated in sort of mergers and acquisitions, and it's been an area I've been quite interested in, and certainly the sort of the technology challenges of when two companies come together. That must be a nightmare when it comes to data, right? Have you had any experience with that, and any key lessons learned from those kind of projects?
Yeah, I think that's when a data strategy is really important. Because what you usually have is one company with bad data purchasing or merging with another company who's also got bad data. An exponential of that bad data could set you back for a very long time trying to figure it out. Take, for example, a customer list. I've worked with organisations who do not have a list of their customers, and which still boggles the mind. And the reason is they've got some customers in one system and customers in another. Like you said a moment ago, that data being very siloed. And if you have got two companies with that, how do you align those customer names? And that's just customers. Forget about accounting ledgers or anything like that. So how do you move forward? So what I try and do is I try to work with these companies, give them a good strategy, and think about a more agile approach. And for me, sorting out the customer information is the most important thing first. You have to know who your customers are. I do think that we will see a lot more mergers and acquisitions from the virus onwards. I read recently that Microsoft were they obviously make decisions about what features to add in.
Sure.
And they were focusing less on small to medium businesses because with the virus, it's expected quite a high percentage of them to fail. And it's sad, but it was the reality of the assessments that they had done. So I think that's quite a sad thing. And I think one way that they will be rejuvenated is by being merged or acquired by other companies.
Yeah. No, I definitely believe that will be the case for many of them. Sure. And what's your do you find clients that you've been working with? There's been lots of talk about AI ethics, and AI ethics covers a broad range of topics, some of which is around the data privacy, data controls, data bias, that kind of thing. Do you find many of the clients that you talk to are concerned about the ethical considerations of their data?
I don't find that at the moment. I do find there's a much larger concern about breaking GDPR.
Okay.
I am trying to talk to customers about it. I think it's something they just maybe have never thought about. I saw a story which alarmed me, which was one of the airline companies had actually set up and created an algorithm which identified who is more likely to pay to sit together. So if you are with your family and your children and you realise during the booking process that actually your seats are all apart, you're more likely to pay more to sit together. And it seemed to me the ethics of that was obviously very interesting. As a parent myself, I want to be sat with my child on any plane flight.
Sure.
And trust me, you want me to sit next to my teenager as well, because he will be pestering me the whole way for sweets and things. So I think for me, that algorithm was ideated, developed, tested, put into production and released. And not one person blew a whistle over that to say, hang on a minute, what does that mean for families? What harm might this do? And I think that is something that people apologise for when they've been caught. And this company was caught actually because there was a number of complaints made to one of the regulatory bodies, a consumer body, and they were caught then.
See, that's
So
for me. That's sorry to interrupt. That's really interesting, right? Because there's
mm,
two use cases for that, right? So there's the obvious, well, there's the bad use case. I'll call it the bad use case, where the plane is still half empty, but they've decided to book a family of five in different seats, just so you'll pay an extra £5 per person to put them together. That's obviously really, really naughty, right? That's really bad. But then there's the other use case where the plane is pretty full and there just isn't five seats together. So, in order to get you those five seats, they've got to rejig a load of other people around, right? And you can argue that's the more sensible use case, because actually, if the company is having to do more admin work to move other people around and essentially mess other people around to make the family sort of sit together, then you can argue that's a good use case. But I'm guessing from your story they were using it in the first bad use case, which
yes,
is really, really bad, right? And I think and this is, for me, this is fundamental to technology and algorithms, that for the same piece of technology, there are really good use cases and potentially a bad use of the same bit of technology, right? And I think that's a perfect example of that. And I think it's really good to sort of highlight that, because and again, it's not that the algorithm was wrong, it was how it was being used, right? And I think that's the key thing to these kinds of issues. So yeah, fantastic. And I guess this sort of then takes you into the, where was the corporate governance and oversight on that type of thing, right? And again, I see, and I see there a lack of, while many organizations, certainly the bigger ones, will have a governance sort of organizational structure, they may not be that savvy with these kind of decision making algorithms that can do some interesting but slightly worrying things that they need a bit more oversight and scrutiny on. Do you see that with some of the sort of SME companies that you've been working with as well, sort of the governance structure coming into play?
yeah, I think with organisations that are small to medium, I don't see much governance, and I think the reason for that is small companies tend to start by cobbling together cloud services. So they might use HubSpot for free, they might use Canva for free, they might use a cheap version of Sage. So they've got lots of data in different pots. And I think they're sort of trusting that governance to the cloud,
Sure.
to the vendor to take care of that. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they're being careful with their data, looking at security in the hard drives, that kind of thing, or having a good password. So I think the governance piece tends to come in as organisations start to grow. I think sometimes companies confuse corporate governance with GDPR. Again, they think those are the same things. And they also think that seems to mean that they understand their data. I think what I have seen is people using that as a way of having power in their own organisations. So one company I worked with, I was trying to get a hold of somebody who knew about a particular system to understand how it was. And the person I was speaking to said, "Oh yeah, I'll put you in touch with them." And a month later, I was still not put in touch with this person. And then I found out that the person I was looking for actually sat 2 rows down from me in the office that I was sitting. And there was deliberate barriers being put up because I didn't know what this person looked like. And it was a chance conversation where I said, "I still haven't spoken to so-and-so yet." They said, "Oh, well, they're sat there, I'll go and introduce you." And this was a different person. So I do think when that sort of thing happens, you think, I am not being empowered to do my job here. And I think it's sort of the end of the road now, because if I can't get to do and pull all the pieces of information together, I need to go and get executive support for that to happen. And that doesn't mean, fortunately, me perhaps having a word with a private CIO to say, "I'm sorry, but your team are putting up barriers." So I see corporate governance being sometimes quite misused and misunderstood.
Mm.
That's not what it's for. It's about asking, I think, what harm might this do? And coming back to the no regret projects, uh, something that people are starting to think about with their projects is what harm might this do and what risk might this bring us? And that risk can be reputational, it can be financial, it could be physical as well. An employee getting hurt in some way if they've not had appropriate training in something. It could be legal. And I think companies are thinking about these things a bit more, which impacts then on AI, because there's something unknown about AI that companies don't feel is confident about in the same way as they might do with doing a hardware upgrade, for example.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Okay, so we're coming up to sort of 10 to the hour. So obviously this show's called the AI Future Show. So I need to sort of ask a little bit in terms of what's your view of the future in terms of data and analytics? How do you see that impacting the sort of commercial world? What would you like to see happen? What advice would you give to companies that are maybe just starting out on their adoption of some of the more sort of predictive analytics?
I think there's going to be a digital divide. I think there is one now. And I think organisations need to make sure they're on the right side of that divide. I do think that's important that everybody understands data better. I sometimes get asked the question, what skills do people have to get into data science? And I think data analysis, statistics, these things are so important. I think it's not just important for organisations that are businesses. I think that's important for us all. We're living in an era of alternate facts and fast headlines, and where we need to scratch under the surface. So I believe quite strongly in the power of things like investigative journalism done properly in order to bring things to the surface. And I think we all need to be our own investigative journalists as well, become more data savvy, and organisations need to remember that data and technology are two different things. And my advice, I think, would be to start thinking about the biggest impacts that you can make in your business and how much of that you can automate. And what sort of things can you farm out and make sure that you stick to your core business principles. So I sometimes get asked to do things which are not in my area, like SharePoint, for example. Nothing wrong with SharePoint, I just don't do it. But I give that to other people because it's not in line with what I do.
Sure.
And I think sticking to what you do and doing it well is really important.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think for me, just sort of summarizing the conversation really. So I think some of the key things that have come out of this conversation has been understand your data. And I think for me, that's always been a really key element to any project. Understand the data and understand that it's not going to be 100% perfect data as well. And know that, you know, I've seen projects where fields have been overloaded to mean different things for different types of rows of data, and all of those little nuances that can really sort of, you know, knock you sideways if you're not aware of it and understand that that's what's been done. And there is that history to data. I won't say versioning, but history, because as people come and go in the organization, the data gets used in different ways and processed in different ways. And all of that can cause problems. But, you know, the way to avoid that, I guess, is to sort of do a deep dive, understand the data, make sure you really sort of know the nuances so that you can factor that into anything that you build on top of that. So I think that's one of the key sort of takeaways from today. And I think I love that sort of phrase of the no regrets project. So for me, that's a really interesting concept. And I think really important for analytics projects that, you know, by their nature has that element of trial and error and potential failure, but lessons learned essentially from that. So I think that's been super useful to sort of tease those two sort of main sort of points for me. Is there anything else from your side that you'd just like to share with the audience before we sort of close the show?
No, it's just to say thank you for inviting me along today. It's been my pleasure to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's been listening. I've definitely tried to sort of bring in some of the questions that we've had on the feed. So thank you all for joining this episode of the AI Future Show, and more will be coming through the podcast and the live shows in the coming months as well. So thank you all for joining. And Jen, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation and some great insights there for people sort of working in the data and analytics space. So thank you very much for your time. Okay, cheers everyone. Bye for now.